Good evening, everybody. We are pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, sponsored by the College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee, College of DuPage Speakers Bureau, and multiple Illinois public libraries. I am John Paris, chair of the College of DuPage Native American Studies Committee and associate professor of history. Joining me tonight are co-sponsoring representatives Joan DePiro, the community engagement specialist at the College of DuPage, Katie Myers, library technical assistant at the Crystal Lake Public Library, and Kate Cundiff, programming specialist at the Algonquin Area Public Library District. Welcome. This is the first in a three-part webinar series, Native American Voices, which will examine the varied aspects of the Native American residential school atrocity across Canada and the US over the past 150 years. The second installment will center on Native women, both in relation to the schools and the closely related MMIWG2S movement, which stands for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two Spirits. It will take place via Zoom on Thursday, May 5th, which is also National MMIWG2S Day. The third installment is scheduled for Friday, September 30th, and will focus on efforts to address this atrocity, support groups, and the concept of truth and reconciliation, which is Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Day. Tonight's event is being recorded for later viewing, and as an attendee, you will not have access to either your camera or microphone. We will be happy to answer any questions you have as time allows after the presentation concludes. You may submit questions at any time by utilizing the Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen. The chat feature has been disabled. Please note that this evening's presentation may contain material that is sensitive to some viewers. At this time, I am honored to introduce tonight's panelists. Please welcome Nell Lee Hapatos Tiedemann, elder of the Menominee tribe and day school survivor. Joy Tiedemann, member of the Menominee tribe who holds a BA at the University of Wisconsin-Superior and a descendant of residential school survivors. Rachel Fernandez, member and tribal legislator of the Menominee Nation of Wisconsin, co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force Data Subcommittee, and executive director of the Woodland Women. And Kayla Johnston, supervisor of Education, Outreach, and Public Programming Office of the Canadian National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. For 150 years, Native American children throughout the US and Canada have been forcibly and systematically ripped from their homes, families, and communities, forced to live at one of hundreds of residential schools established to pursue the goal of acculturation. The pain and trauma experienced by countless victims, families, Native peoples, and humanity itself is immeasurable. No one source can completely convey the scope of this atrocity, but much like a picture that speaks 1,000 words, the poignancy of a brave Native poet artfully and authentically speaking her voice is a powerful way to begin. The following 7-minute video clip features Michaela Webb-Kamigad, an Ojibwe student leader at Algoma University in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. She is presenting at the 5th Annual Building Reconciliation Forum in October of 2019. Her poem is entitled, Home Isn't Home.
Home isn't home. Home isn't home when you're stolen from it at the age of 4. A small girl, long dark hair, sun-kissed golden brown, who plays with her brothers. Until then, you knew nothing but love. Home isn't home when you're taken to a cold place, filled with other small girls who once had long dark hair, were sun-kissed golden brown and played with their brothers. The small girls who once knew nothing but love. Home isn't home when the cold place is scary, filled with mean men and women who only wear black. They treat these small girls like they don't matter and only deserve the leftover trash. The small girls who once knew nothing but love. Home isn't home when the small girl finally returns home, only to be sent away to live in a place filled with white walls, to live years in a hospital bed because the small girl had what all small girls had, with her long dark hair, sun-kissed golden brown, who once knew nothing but love. Home isn't home when the small girl grows up, living all over the world. She faces battles for all the small girls who have long dark hair and are sun-kissed golden brown, but forgets she once knew nothing but love. Home isn't home when the past is present, when the small girl has her own. A small girl, long dark hair, sun-kissed golden brown who plays with her brothers, who only wants nothing but love. Home isn't home when she finally has one. She has forgotten all of the love. Her family she created now sees what the cold place has done, and the white walls have become eggshells to walk on. Home isn't home when the rest is uneasy, when the small girls are still small, when it becomes a burden to have long dark hair and be sun-kissed golden brown. We forget that we once knew nothing but love. Ani bojo ni bibin baneshi kwe minwa kwashkike kwe ndijnakas. Kwa minwa njajak nodem ukwamakong manatona missing dojaba batsingdara nishnabe kwenda. My given name is Michaela Webb-Kemiget. My Anishinaabe names translate to Dancing Bird Woman and Bear Medicine Woman. I am of the Bear and Crane clans. I was born in Calgary, Alberta, grew up here in Sault Ste. Marie, but originally come from and belong to Uquamacong Unceded Indian Reserve, located on Manitoulin Island. And this is where the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi people reside. I am the granddaughter of Beatrice Ronde, Jimmy Edgar, Marjorie DeBosque, and Billy Webb-Kemiget. I currently attend school here at Algoma University as a social work major with a minor in Anishinaabe Studies. I extend greetings and handshakes to all of you and welcome you to Bao'ting, a gathering place of leaders for thousands of years and also my home. Over the last few weeks, I have wondered, worried, what words I would share with all of you. I wondered, how do I best represent myself, my family, my home, my community, my school, my people, and the legacy that comes with all of that. It wasn't until I sat down at my Grandma B's raggedy old computer and I, was trying to think of what to write. And honestly, that computer is probably as old as I am. So it wasn't until that moment that I thought, this right here, standing here at this podium in front of all of you, that is how I best represent myself, my family, my home, my community, my school, my people, and the legacy that has brought us all here together today and this week. Sharing my truth with all of you. The poem I shared with you was written as the granddaughter of 3 residential school students. The poem was written as the granddaughter who witnessed the lingering pain of residential school and the TB hospitalizations. It was written as the granddaughter who still feels the residue 2 generations out. But most importantly, It was written as the granddaughter who comes from a strong line of Anishinaabe people and who will continue to tell her truth and share in the legacy of resiliency. Niko Kapajagun, the string that binds us all together. Reconciliation. Thank all of you for the opportunity to share my words with you. I am very grateful to be able to stand up here and speak. This right here is what the small girl in my poem fought for. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the forum. Miigwech.
And now, again, I would like to welcome Joy and Nellie Hapatos Tiedemann and Rachel Fernandez.
Poso Anetna. My name is Kimokwe Apata, means eagle women who flies in forever lightning. Menominee Potawatomi, and my English name, not by choice, is Nellie Hapatas or Petronella. That's supposedly Christian name. I didn't know that was me until I was in kindergarten. And I can relate to the poem that she just said, because it kind of relates to what I would say, being a survivor who lived through the trauma, who is still traumatized, and who still someday is not a survivor. I support people who can come forward. I support my daughter here who is doing her education on bringing stuff forward, because I lived this. And we can go back to when we were, before we even went to school, we were loved. We were sent to school where we were told, no, that's not right. Or why did you do it that way? Or real stern, nothing verbally calming or creative or soothing. It was just start and go all day, and don't do this, don't do that, and stand up straight, and why did you do this? And don't you have a cleaner shirt? And they'd say this in front of our playmates, the people we grew up with. And sometimes our cousins would have the cleanest dirty shirt they had, but they still made it to school. And then teachers those nuns would confront them, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They made it to school, which was harsh in its own way, because from the time we were in kindergarten, we were sent to school. Things were done to our friends. In the morning, they would take a yardstick, and that's when masking tape first came, like duct tape is now. Masking tape was a favorite of whatever you needed it to be. They would wrap a yardstick so far down a yardstick, and they would slam it on their desk. And we would have to, that would be the focal point of sitting up straight. Don't make eye contact with the teacher, because that's a threat to her. You're challenging her, and keep your eyes down, do your work. Don't talk to your friends. Don't smile at your friends. Don't do this. You just got to study. And most of us cried. Most of us cried the whole day. A lot of them had wet themselves because of the harshness of these sacred women that we were told they were. We were told you go to school and you learn from the best. These are sacred women. You go to church, and this is what you learn in church. And what happened was, from kindergarten on, we got our language beat out of us, and we got the Latin, the prayers of the church beat into us. So when all the years we grew up, we didn't know how to be. We didn't know how to be happy once we left our door and walked in the school doors. All we know how to do is, talking from my experiences, to be scared, to stutter, to have the nuns come after you when you stuttered, when you looked and smiled, when somebody made a little funny joke. And we were told, you do not speak Menominee. You do not. That's not your, in this school, you are English. In this school, you are a Christian. And when we would go to ceremonies like up in Zor, where our traditional culture and in our meeting and our ceremonies would happen, we were stood in front of the class and we were called pagans. And we had to stand there, and our friends, our family, our people who would have to sit there and call us pagans 3 times. You're a pagan, you're a pagan, you're a pagan. And so that became the norm. That was, people who knew better. My best friend, Barb Waka, Kakatosh Turtleot, would cry. She cried because she had to call me a pagan. She used to say, take me with you. I want to come there and see why you come back so happy. I want to come there and see what they do up there. And yet she came from the Christian family where it was like 2 different worlds, yet we were cousins. We were first playmates. We grew up together. We shared so much as being scared to go to school. We would walk real slow to be late. Then we'd get slapped up for being late. Then we'd get taken over to the Catholic Church and we had to confess our sins. We were late because we didn't want to come to school. That was a sin. And we didn't know exactly what sins are because at home we would say, they would tell us, oh, you did a good job. Or, oh my goodness, did somebody help you with that? I didn't know you could do such a good job. Oh my, and all the love and all the spirituality and all the sewing and the culture that was taught to us, we were taught that our way of life, our culture was not a religion. It was a daily experience. This is what you learned at a certain age, and this is what you do at a certain age. But most of all, you learned respect. This is how you respect things. This is how you respect yourself. Know yourself. This is what you can do. You did a good job. And then we'd enter those school doors, and it was just like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And when you're little, you don't know the difference. You don't know the difference between fear and love. All you know, that's how you feel. You didn't know there was, something called in between, because there never was. There was never an in between. It was either love or being told, no, you did wrong. This is not the way to, shut up, sit down, behave yourself, and look at your paper, finish your paper, do this, and get hit by that yardstick if you just momentarily gazed at somebody else and smiled. You'd get cracked across the hands. And of course, I have to tell you the personal experience. I was left-handed, and the nuns called us left-handed. There was numerous of us in the school, children of the devil. We were children of the devil because we were different. We were not supposed to be writing with our left hand because it was not normal. This is what's going to happen to you. So every time I picked up a pencil, I had to look down and I had to really work at not picking up that crayon or that pencil or piece of paper with my left hand, because I knew the nun was standing there just waiting for me to crack me on my hands. And that she did. And it took a long time for me to realize that. I didn't know I was not supposed to do that. It didn't feel right. It would be like taking somebody that's right-handed and cracking them and making them, cracking them in a right hand and making them draw, pick up a pencil, paper, whatever, eat, cut something with a scissors with your left hand. It throws off your sight, your hearing. You can't walk straight. And that's one of the things they would make me do is walk a line. And I couldn't, because I would get chastised for using my left hand constantly. I didn't know. And at home, they taught me how to sew with my left hand, how to paint, how to color, how to do things, how to cook, how to stir things with my left hand. They allowed me to do that. I was not a child of the devil. I was somebody that would be a helper, a helper, a person that could learn how to do this, fry bread, mix bread, totally everything. And when we would get older, like in the 4th or 5th grade, we would become aware that there's a difference between boys and girls. And there was a lot of trauma between that, because we were accused, as soon as we would smile at our cousins, at our brothers, we would be accused of being sinful. And we didn't know why. And that was a dirty look. Smiling at my own cousin, it was a dirty, dirty look. And we didn't know what dirty meant. In the eyes of the nuns, we were never good enough. I was never good enough. To this day, people who are, I don't know, they intimidate me. I can tell by their voice I'm not good enough. And this is a 300-pound nun standing in back of me with a yardstick wrapped in tape, just waiting for me to pick up something with my left hand, waiting for me to smile at another man, to smile at somebody that I knew for the rest of my life from the beginning. We were taught that we were dirty, our clothes were dirty, and yet our hair, we were not allowed to wear braids. It had to be back in a ponytail in the back by our shoulders. And if we did something wrong, those nuns would just come and grab it and yank it, sometimes right out of our desk, right to the floor. And the boys were not allowed to have long hair, but in the ones that did ceremony, they were always pulled by the braids. They were just yanked around. They were swung around in front of the class and just tortured. We didn't know why. We didn't know why this was all happening to us. And yet when you're so young, there are some secrets you put in your 7th direction that nobody knows, that only you can feel. Christians call it a soul. Native people call it the 7th direction. You put things there that you don't want other people to know, things you're afraid of, things that hurt you. There's a numerous things that reach out, and every once in a while they rear their head and you got to acknowledge them. And no matter how old you get, you think, oh, I lived through that. Why did they do that? Why did they hit me? Why was I born left-handed? And why was I born a twin? Why was this? Why was it? And we had nobody to answer, because these were sacred women. And when we went home, it was just like we were treated so different, night and day. Our parents we weren't the Waltons, but we were close, loved, accepted. We weren't dirty. We weren't, unusual for us to laugh. We could laugh, we could just tell stories about each other, but never of school. They never asked us how school went, because in some way in back of their heads, I think they knew. I think they knew what these sacred women were doing to us. And I think they accepted it because they were told these were sacred women. And why would something sacred be so cruel? You know, when we went to ceremonies, there was nobody that would say, sit down, shut up. You know, it was that way. They would welcome the spirits of young kids because they were pure. They would welcome laughter. And when a baby would cry or get upset, there were so many people that would stand up and want to walk the baby around or take care of the baby or do something to be helpful. And it was just that way. We grew up in a very cruel world at school, in a very loving world, just like the lady before us said about her poem. That's all true. I lived it. And some days I'm a survivor and some days I'm not. Some days I can go right back to the time and place and the nun standing in back of me and the nun criticizing me. And, you know, I stuttered when I was scared. I still do that every now and then. I go right back, you know, and how they would make us wash our hands like they were trying to wash the brown out of us. They couldn't. They couldn't wash the brown off me. I'm still brown. They called us red. We're not red. We're brown people. And they were non-Indian people. And their skin was flawless. It was white. And the first, I loved horses. And the first time I ever seen a zebra, I took a paper and I drew a horse and I put zebra lines on it. And the nun coming back to me and she hit me right across the arms. And she said, you ripped that up. You're making fun of me because my habit is black and white. And you drew a horse black and white. And I try to tell her it's a zebra, but she wouldn't listen. She put me in a corner. She grabbed me by the hair and run me to the corner and made me rip my horse picture up. And I knew in my heart it wasn't a horse. It was a zebra. I had no intentions of making fun of this nun. And we didn't know what, humor. Native people, you can always tell where 3 or 4 of them are because you hear laughter. They have a humorous way of talking to each other. We have such a Indian humor that you have to understand it. And the nuns would quit your laughing outside on the playground. We had to stop laughing. And now, it's good to see people and the people I grew up with that are my age. We don't talk about how we did in school. We never, ever talk unless it's something like this, unless we have to go back. And we choose to go back, but many of them don't. So I got a lot more to say, but I think my daughter should say something because I'm so darn proud of her and her education, what she had to go through to get this far. So, and Rachel is the backbone of our women's sewing group and the backbone of a lot of stuff that goes on this reservation. And she wears a skirt everywhere she goes to show her femininity. And I'm so proud of her black and white hair. It shows her knowledge. So there we go.
Also, Mawanay Nueswana Sawanoki. Before I had my English name, my Joy Tiedemann, I had my Menominee name. Sawanoki means either yellow woman or Eastern woman, depending on who's translating. My mother's auntie my great aunt Jane gave it to me. It wasn't easy being her daughter.
Oh, jeez.
And I say that with love.
Yeah, right.
She made choices for us when she decided to have kids. She decided to move away from the reservation because she didn't want us to go to those schools. So we moved to Rhinelander, Wisconsin is where we ended up. And I still ended up in a Catholic school, and I still had some of the same experiences. I was told I was dirty because I was the only brown girl in my class. I was, told I didn't have a soul and stuff like that. But I was okay with that because that was not how things were at home. And that didn't really mean anything to me. I went to UW Superior, and I majored in history and minored in anthropology. And for my senior thesis, I did a study of the boarding school at Tomah, Wisconsin. And through doing my studies there, I learned a lot about her. She went to a day school. My grandma went to a day school. They didn't talk about it when I was younger. I think I was probably in my 30s before anybody ever said anything about my grandma's school experience, and all they ever said was it was a bad time, and that was it. But I knew what that meant because of the schools, because of sitting in the archives in Chicago and holding the letters that parents had written to their children, asking how they were, asking if they could come for a visit, asking for anything. And you could see that they had to pay somebody to write these letters. And at the time these letters were sent, Native communities were so depressed economically that you have to know that every penny was precious, and to spend even one penny to write that letter, to send it to that school, to find out about how your child is doing, meant so much because it took so much away from the family. And most of those letters were ignored. They were just put in the file. The kid never saw them, and the parents never got a response. I have a friend who, her grandfather was taken from White Earth, Minnesota. His older brother and his younger sibling were taken. They were supposed to go to the boarding school at White Earth, but they ended up at the state school in Owatonna. And their intake paper says, dark hair, brown eyes, brown skin, good teeth. Indian. Their outtake paperwork says brown hair, brown eyes, brown skin, good teeth, white. And the two older brothers were indentured out as servants to families in the area. The youngest sibling was put on paper as a boy, but was actually a girl, and was sent to a family in Arizona. My friend didn't find her great aunt or her great uncle until last year. And that story is so common. And it's people say that they don't know any Native people, but you probably do. They don't know that they're Native, some of them. Some of them are still too afraid to admit it. And boarding schools and the day schools, the mission schools, and the state schools, the privately run schools, they impacted the life of every single Native person, every First Nations person on Turtle Island from the time they opened to today and into the future. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to give Rachel the rest.
Also, Mauni Uyak, ne Eswisia na Maukuki, Nito Tamoasa. Hello, everyone. My Menominee name is Namaukuki, and that means sturgeon woman. I am Bear Clan. My government name is, English name is Rachel Fernandez. I'm enrolled Menominee Indian tribal member. And I could sit and listen to Miss Nell all night with her stories because it's the truth. What she says is what has happened to our people. So first, I will not apologize for the truth speaking that I am about to give to you. I will not apologize for making you feel uncomfortable as I speak my truth, our collective truth to power. It is not my role or responsibility to educate you on histories that have been omitted. I put it on you, the listener, to find that history and learn. Because when we are uncomfortable, we have the opportunity to grow. I challenge you all to grow and embrace that feeling of being uncomfortable. There are many people today who do not know the truth behind the genocide or what genocide is and what our ancestors endured. Assimilation, genocide, and the continued oppression of our people are some of the many human rights injustices that need to be exposed and called to action over and over and over until we have just acknowledgement and responsibility is taken for the horrendous acts of violence against our relatives. Our will to survive and to sustain our culture and way of life comes from the strength and resistance of our survivors and our ancestors. And I say that with love for our ancestors, because as we speak today, I encourage everyone to please drink your water and take care of yourself, because some of the things that we will hear will be hard to fathom, that horrendous acts of violence were committed against our people, against our children, when they were taken away from our families. And now we have the historical trauma, and we have to heal from that unresolved grief that was caused by these boarding schools, these day schools, the oppression and the assimilation that was put on us. And as we talk about the boarding schools, we have the impact of these boarding schools. And with individuals, we can see this in our communities, you know, how the loss of identity, how some of our children were taken away and, you know, they couldn't speak their language. You know, everything that Miss Nell said happened to us where we couldn't speak our Menominee language. We have low self-esteem, no sense of safety. You feel institutionalized because you've been put through that whole traumatic, you know, era, and you have difficulty forming those healthy relationships. We see those now in our individuals because all of this trauma has been passed down intergenerationally. This trauma has been passed down, and sometimes we don't even recognize it. I didn't recognize it in myself when things happened to my ancestors, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles. And my uncle shared a story with me, and he told me that I could share it. He shared a story with me about his mom, my great aunt, and how she escaped, or she tried to escape. She tried to escape many times. And every time they would come back and get her, she was on the train, and they would come and get her. The government officials would come and get her and take her back, and they would torture her. She knew Menominee, but she wasn't allowed to speak it. She tried to speak it. They tortured her. They did unspeakable things to her. And every time she tried to escape, she tried to jump on that train and come back, they would catch her. But the last time when she escaped, someone gave her a ticket because how it was set up on the train. Certain people had tickets, certain people didn't. She had a ticket, so it was away from where they usually checked for her kids. And so with that ticket, she was able to escape and she was able to come home. Now, my uncle, as he was growing up, he wanted to learn the language. He wanted to learn Menominee language, and he asked, his mom, my aunt, tried to ask her about the language, and she didn't want him to learn it. He didn't understand why. And so he went and he learned the language, and he thought, because he knew that his mom used to be a language speaker. So he went and learned the language and tried to go talk and speak with his mom, and it sent her into a breakdown. It brought her right back to when she was tortured, when she was beaten, when they did those unspeakable acts to her. And he didn't understand until his dad let him know what happened and why it happened. And so that put him on a road to healing and understanding where all that came from. And my aunt got better, but it took her a while because that was so ingrained in her that you do not speak the language. It really broke their heart to see her go through that, broke his heart. But he ended up going on and trying to bring that healing to the community. And when we think about our tribal communities, when we talk about historical trauma, it's that loss of that sense of community, and how all of that is still passed down to us in some shape or form, because we have that lateral violence in our communities yet. Our loss of language in the stories, perfect example of what happened to my aunt. And the loss of our tribal traditions and ceremonies. And I don't think people really understand unless you hear stories of our elders. And I think it's important that we do that we seek out our elders, we seek out the truth, we seek out what really happened, because what's written in our books isn't what really happened. We have all these knowledge holders in our communities, our tribal communities, that have these stories, the ones that survived, the ones that came home, because there are so many that never even came home. There are so many of our people where their parents didn't even know what happened to them. So many of those graves out there with our little ones in them. People need to know this. People need to hear this. And when we talk about our families, our Native youth, right now, because of that intergenerational trauma, our youth have disparities in healthcare, education, and you see a lot of them committing suicide. That's a big issue with our communities, within our communities, because with all of this trauma being passed down through our generations, our youth are out there and they're angry, and they don't even know why they're angry. It's from all of that trauma being passed down. And how we heal that is we connect them to who they are. And that is some of the work of grassroots people, of tribes that are doing the work, that want to help their communities heal, their tribal members heal. It's very important that we connect and we have the opportunity to heal. I wanted to share something before I jump off. Something that was given to me. We are land, air, and water. We are the sun, the moon, the stars. We are the legacy of our ancestors who fought against genocide so that we could be here on our original land today. We are the language, the culture, the teachings. We are part of the bearers of the future 7 generations. We are the opportunity, the change makers, the leaders. We are the connection to continued growth and breaking cycles. So even though we are here to speak truth to power, our collective truth to power, and all of these terrible acts, everything that has happened to us, don't feel sorry for us. You stand with us and be that ally out there, and tell the truth also when someone tells something that isn't right. Learn about this. Learn about us. There's so many histories. There are so many tribes out there that had to go through all of this, of our children being taken away. It's up to us as a collective to make sure that this truth is brought to light. Because what always happens in darkness comes to light. Annette Mawanan.
Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Kayla Johnston.
Thank you very much, Nellie, Joy, Rachel. It is an honor to follow you, to follow 3 great, powerful women sharing some of their experiences, having lived these experiences as day school survivors, intergenerational survivors, residential school intergen survivors. I myself, I'm an intergenerational survivor. So my mother attended residential school, as did her siblings, her parents, and extended family. And just to add a little more to my introduction, how I got started in this work was one of the first statement gatherers hired on by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada. And that's actually one of my first jobs. And I've been doing this work for the past maybe 12 years now in various forms, from gathering statements, hearing the stories and experiences from survivors and families, to engaging with communities, to doing research, and now in education. So in this last little section, I have a little more of a formalized slideshow deck, which I'm going to share. Perfect. And throughout my little chat, I'm also going to be pulling up the chat, as I have some links to some resources and things that I chat about throughout. Now, with that, let's jump right into things. First one being, I want to show a pictorial representation of what residential schools, of what day schools and other colonial policies wanted to do through assimilation. And so what you see here is a before and after photo taken of a young boy named Thomas Moore Kiesick as he appeared when he was admitted into the Regina Indian Industrial School in the 1890s. Now, there is a very good podcast that was released by The Secret Life of Canada. So that's going to be my first link I'm going to put in the chat for all panelists and attendees. And that specific episode is called The Boy in the Picture, as for a long time, not a lot was known about Thomas Moore, even though this picture is used on a lot of materials about residential schools. You see it on a lot of books like Tom Mulroy's A National Crime. Now, what to take away from these photos are their propaganda-based pieces. They were printed in the Indian Affairs Report in 1897 to show the transformation children would go through. As you know, that purpose the government and churches said of these schools was to civilize, Christianize Indigenous children. The easiest means of doing so was removing them from that influence of culture, from influence of family, and from the influence of community. And when put into practice, that's an attack on our identities. So we see that before and after picture taken. And I want you to look at Thomas on the left-hand side. What archivists and individuals have said about this photo is this actually is women's regalia that they've dressed him up in. You can kind of see the slip of his own clothing underneath, but this is not what he looked like when he came to the school. This is what they wanted, that stereotype or image of a Plains Indian to promote what that transformation would be. If we look at Thomas on the right-hand side with his hair cropped short, that military style uniform, very popular at that time. Now you can even look at that before picture and you see he's holding a little gun. And again, it was meant to play upon those stereotypes. Now, after the publication of these photos, Thomas had already passed away. He contracted what was likely tuberculosis and passed away at the age of 12 or so. Now, the other quote, or the other little piece I wanted to go before we jump into some other slides, is a quote from this fellow here. Up on screen, I have a man by the name of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Superintendent of the Indian Affairs Office. And to emphasize what that policy was at that time, here's a quote that he said in the House of Commons. "I want to get rid of that Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed by the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department." So we can see quite clearly from this quote what that purpose was when it came to policies like residential schools. Now, before you jumped into the formal webinar, you would have seen some slides I had rotating. So I'm just going to briefly touch upon one or two of these. Now up on screen, I have some quick key facts about residential schools in Canada. There were boarding type schools in Canada, really from the 1600s onwards when the missionaries were first arriving. But the system as a system really did not occur until the 1800s when the federal government became involved in funding some of these church-run boarding schools right after our Confederation. Now, another big key point in this history is in 1920, they amended the Indian Act, legislation that was meant to control Indigenous peoples. And it required all First Nations children between 7 and 15 to attend either a day school or a residential school. Now, as enforcement of attendance increased, Indian agents and RCMP, or Royal Canadian Mounted Police, could forcibly remove children from their homes. They could find the parents or guardians, jail them, and in some cases, they actually took away rations and starved communities and families. Now, you often hear a couple different dates for when the schools closed, 1996 and 1998. The reason for this is 1996 is the year that the last residence in Canada closed. 1998 was the year that the last former school closed. And it's estimated over this history, there were at least 150,000 children who attended, but that number is actually likely much greater. But because of the loss and destruction of records, we won't know that answer. Now, this is one of the slides that would have been rotating, and it's a map representation of the residential schools across Canada. The Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement recognizes 141 schools. And then there are 5 schools in Newfoundland and Labrador that are also recognized under a separate agreement. And so this style map and information about those schools can be pulled from our archives. And that's the next link I'm putting in the chat for you. Now, what I want you to take away from this and from the chats is for the fact that any map or statistic you see is really the lowest based estimate. So if we were to imagine this map to include all of the unrecognized residential schools, day schools, Indian hospitals and sanatoriums, schools that were run by the province or territory alone, it would look so much more crowded. And in fact, I have a list here of the top reasons why an institution was excluded from the settlement agreement. And the reason for this is because this was a settlement agreement that involved the federal government. So if the federal government could not be shown involved with the school, it wasn't included. So the top three reasons were the institution was run by the province or territory alone in Canada, that it was a day school, or that there wasn't enough information. In fact, there were over 1,531 unique institutions put forward for recognition. And as you saw, 141, that's only about 9% that are formally recognized. Now, you'll notice most of my stuff is focused on that Canadian context because of our location, but I did want to show one slide that was developed by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition that lists all of the known boarding schools in America. So I put a link to that also in the chat. And so I actually attended an event most recently, just before Christmas, involving the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They also call themselves NABS, which is a little shorter. But that 332 schools, I believe it's actually increased. This is a graphic they have to, they still have to edit. As you can see, there's a little denote marker. I believe this comes from 2017 or 2018. So there's, I imagine, quite a few that needs to be added. Now, just being cognizant of time, I'm going to keep moving ahead. Just to briefly touch about the settlement agreement and then our center and what we do, who we are, and why the stories we hold are so important. Now, in 2005, the Government of Canada and the Assembly of First Nations signed a political agreement with the goal of achieving a court-sanctioned resolution to all outstanding litigations involving the harms caused at residential schools. Now, in 2006, those negotiations were approved between the legal advisors for survivors, the churches, as well as the Government of Canada to implement the IRSSA or IRSA. Now, this agreement says that harms and abuses were committed against many children who attended residential school. And this agreement was created to have a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of residential schools. And so overall, there are 5 major pieces to this agreement. Just due to time, I won't go into all of them, but that common experience payment, or the CEP, and the IAP, or the independent assessment process, were both compensation-based pieces. But there were also funds set aside for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and healing initiatives. There was funds set aside for commemoration. And then there were funds set aside for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you can see branching off that, we have our center. So when it comes to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008, they were founded as a sincere acknowledgement for the injustices and harms caused by residential schools. There were 3 commissioners appointed at that time. They resigned shortly thereafter, and 3 new commissioners, which are the ones you see pictured on screen, were then appointed. The Honorable Murray Sinclair, Dr. Marie Wilson, and Chief Wilton Littlechild. And through their work, they had to, A, tell Canadians what happened in residential schools. They had to honor the lives of former students and families. And they had to create a permanent record of that residential school legacy. And how they did that, or part of that work, involved gathering statements and experiences from those survivors, from community members, from family members. So with all of that, they started their work officially in 2010 with the first national event. And by 2015, they released their final report and closed off shop, which leads to our center. So the agreement had mandated the commission create an archive for all of the statements, documents, and materials collected during its mandate. And in 2012, the TRC issued a call for submissions for an organization to become this host. Now, after a lengthy review process, custodianship was awarded to the University of Manitoba. So in 2013, our trust deed and administrative agreements were signed. In 2014, our first director was appointed. And in 2015, we opened our doors officially. So who are we? What do we do? We are here as the permanent home for all those archival statements, documents, materials gathered by the TRC, and to ensure, first and foremost, we are serving our survivors, that their families have access to this history, that we can share with educators this history so they can do it in a good way in the classroom, that we can let researchers in and delve deeper into the mysteries that exist primarily for me, what stands out are the medical mysteries that happened at residential school. And I realized I don't have a link for what I'm going to mention next, but if you do have time, mark down the name Ian Mosby and his 2013 article about the nutritional experiments being done in residential schools. Now, the last two, the history and the public, are so closely related. We are here to ensure that this history is never forgotten or repeated, and that the materials in our collection can help foster reconciliation. Now, going back and touching upon who we serve, our survivors and families, this is one of our primary concerns, is getting this information into the hands of those that it belongs. Since opening and starting to take in requests, we have had received 1,028 since 2017. And in the last 2 years, we've actually received 1,647 requests, including over this is where I messed up here, 1,647 requests, which includes the 1,028 survivor-specific requests. And so this is something we do completely free of charge. And what we provide are government records, survivor records, church records, everything you can think of under the sun, from RCMP or police files to admissions and discharge records, full statements, collections of photographs, newsletters, yearbooks, photos, as well as over 2,500 physical objects. And what's special about our archive, what makes us unique, is we have a public database where you can access over 59,000 items of our 5 million holding. We have a proactive release schedule where over time we'll be releasing more and more of these records to the public. And so right now you can get access to over 36,000 text documents, over 19,000 historical and contemporary photos, and over 1,000 videos, many of them being survivor statements given in the public and sharing circles and in front of the commissioners at the TRC. And so this is what our archival website looks like. I shared a link already, but I really just wanted to highlight this component and to bring out some important pieces when it comes to why our collection is so important. It's for the fact that, abusers do not create records of abuse. If we want to know that true experience, that lived experience of residential schools, we have to go to those survivors and those families. And unfortunately, as time marches on, more and more of our direct connections to this history are passing on. In 2008, when the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, gave the formal apology for residential schools, it was estimated there were 80,000 survivors alive in Canada. The last mark I checked, there was under 40,000. And again, as time marches on, we will lose that connection. And so not only do we have the governmental records, not only do we have church records, we have the other half of that story, which is that survivor component. And the reason why this is so important is for the fact that we hear people say today, why don't Indigenous people just get over it? And it's very easy for those who haven't suffered these very traumatic histories to ask why we haven't just moved on. Well, these assimilative policies and practices have decreased quality of life. It continues in our everyday systems, in our structures. It is built in. Now, with that, it's important to understand that when you don't know your own identity, your family, or the history of your people, and you have no one to ask, if there are no children in the community, no one to carry on those family or community traditions, that's a reality for many communities today. And so a collective acknowledgement of this history and the impact of colonialism and a compassionate recognition for those who've been harmed will help pave the way to a better future. So in order for us to be present now, we have to understand this past. We can't change what happened, but we can acknowledge the impact it's had on people's lives and that wounds do need to be healed. Our country's history and the United States history and these colonial practices have left their mark on Indigenous peoples, and erasing this past is not an option. Now, I know I'm creeping over a little bit into the Q&A portion, but it was really important for me just to close off to give you a little more information related to the unmarked burials and missing children here in Canada. So I'm going to wrap with that. So residential schools were built with cemeteries attached, And most of those cemeteries were established informally because there was a lack of regulations. The focus was keeping costs low. And so with that, it was rare for these cemeteries to actually be registered. As a result, they may not be identified in provincial or territorial records. Oftentimes, they use wooden grave markers and crosses that are lost in fires and floods and decay naturally. Now, over the Truth Commission's research, they identified 144 of these sites, but there could be upwards of 1 to 3 unidentified sites per school. So that already brings us up to 400 sites that need to be searched. My asterisk to this is that's only for those recognized schools under that settlement agreement. There still could be unmarked burial sites related to unrecognized residential schools or Indian hospitals or sanatoriums or these church-run schools or provincially or territorially run schools. So that's quite a lot of work that needs to be done. And one of the questions we often get asked is how many children have been identified? The TRC identified just over 3,000, so 3,672 deaths, but that's a combined number of named and unnamed students. The records are incomplete. A third of records have no name, a fourth have no gender, and half of them have no cause of death listed. We've continued to do work that the Truth Commission started, and we've since identified 4,126 confirmed deaths. Now, in September of 2019, we launched our memorial register. This is something you can access on our website. It's the list of all of the identified children in the schools they attended. The photos that you're seeing now are of our ceremony we held in Gatineau, Quebec at the History Museum, where we printed all of the names of the children we've identified on this large red banner. Now, the last photo I'm ending off with is a very powerful photo for me. On the left-hand side, we have Stephanie Scott, who is our current executive director, and she's cradling the banner with Joyce Hunter, who's an intergenerational survivor and whose brother, Charlie Hunter, died at the Moose Factory Residential School. He went out on the ice to save a boy who had fallen through, and unfortunately, while he did save the other boy, he himself drowned. Now, he was buried about halfway from his home community in the school in a place called Moosonee. And in 2013, a newspaper, the Toronto Star, worked with Joyce to repatriate his body back home. So she was involved in this ceremony for us. Our goal with this project is to create a profile for each student, who they are, where they came from, where they belong, respect family and communities, bring an Indigenous perspective to reconciliation, remembrance, and breaking away from colonial models, and then providing rights, right to justice, right to guarantee this won't happen again, the right to reparations, and the right to know the truth. Now, what we are doing, or what we've done, is we're moving into phase 2 of the Missing Children Project. In phase 1, we launched the database, we created the register, and we investigated all incomplete cases of lost children. In phase 2, we're looking at records the TRC did not have time to research. There are 98 sets of those records, over 2.4 million of them, which still need to be searched before we can say we've looked at all the records about the residential schools recognized under the agreement and that we have in this collection. Now, remember, I said that little caveat is this is only for the recognized schools. There's still so much work that needs to be done for unrecognized schools. But here I have is a map. It's very similar to the one I showed earlier, but the dots this time, the colors mean black are communities that have completed residential school grave searches using oftentimes penetrating radar. And then the red dots represent those in progress. So there have been 14 searches completed from Cooper Island out on the West Coast, all the way to the east at Shubenacadie. And there are 22 in progress. There are 5 that are happening in BC, 4 in Alberta. There are 5 happening in Saskatchewan, 3 in Manitoba. There are 3 happening in Ontario and 1 in Quebec. And so all this information you have heard up until this point from the unmarked graves found at the Kamloops Residential School, 200 of them, that kickstarted this profound interest and desire to know in May of 2020, to those most recent announcements coming out of Saskatchewan at the St. Philip's and Fort Pelly School. That was 8 years worth of research and work. And so now we still have many schools that need to be searched and many communities that are looking for answers. So what we found is there's a renewed urgency to produce information and provide access. We've been in talks with religious institutions overseas in Europe and France and Rome, as well as with the government, to retain or get hold of the records that are still outside of our collection. And so repositories that were once really reluctant to open up have now come forward with a newfound willingness to work with us, as well as an effort to work to identify other school records which we may not be aware of. And so this provides us with the opportunity to undo those omissions, to work with communities and get the information into their hands so that they can do this work around memorialization, commemoration, to works with the cemeteries, or even the possibility of repatriation. So with that, that was my long presentation here. The last thing I'll end up on is a little bit of more photos. Is where are we going from here? We're continuing to grow. In 2021, we expanded to over 30 staff to address the demands and to continue projects. And in August of last year, we had a land blessing ceremony where we broke the ground and created the first step of envisioning the new permanent home of the NCTR. And so I'm going to stop my slide deck here. And I believe we're now going to move into questions.
Thank you all so much is an understatement, but I will say thank you so much for your honesty, your information, your truth, and your bravery. We'll transition now to questions. We have quite a few that have come in, so I think I'll just read them in the order that I see them, in reverse time order. The latest question from an anonymous attendee, and this is a question that a number of you can all chime in on if you'd like. In the legal arena, are you also updating the police database with missing persons data? That not only speaks to what Kayla just talked about, but Rachel also has direct experience with the MMIWG2S movement, which deal directly with this issue. So if you'd like to address that question.
What was the question again, John? I'm sorry.
Sure thing. In the legal arena, are you also updating the police database with missing persons data? So maybe you could either directly answer that, or maybe broaden the answer to discuss just, the issue of missing persons data and relations with agencies like the NCTR and your organization, Rachel, and police and law enforcement. Maybe would be a good way of answering this.
Well, this is why one of the reasons why we across the nation have been creating task force, MMIW task force, is because we don't have that data. We don't even have the correct data at times. We're not recognized. We're not valued in that way. So when someone goes missing, yes, we report them missing, but some of that data is misinformed, is written down wrong. Sometimes they don't get acknowledged at all. It's really, really frustrating when we don't have law enforcement that will help. Being helpful or being harmful instead of helpful. So I just have to say that we sometimes they're in a NamUs, the database. Sometimes they're not, but there isn't anything specific to our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives.
Thank you for that answer. Maybe the question also was something to do with the victims of the residential schools and the day schools. Any involvement of law enforcement that you could speak to, either in the US from Rachel's perspective or from Canada and Kayla's perspective, or Joy and Nellie certainly chime in, anything you would like to say related to that question.
Related to legal, like, law enforcement was in partnership with the schools in many cases. They would return students. There's so many stories where you hear people, survivors, that they escaped, they were caught, and they were taken back by the police. There are so many, like, we focus a lot on the known burial sites, the suspected burial sites, but there's a long way between where many of these children were born and lived to where they went to school, and not all of them survived the trip. So we don't know where they are along the way. A lot of times, if the bodies are found, like past and current, they're not identified as Native. They may be misidentified as Hispanic or Mexican, or even in some cases with the lighter skinned tribes, they are identified as white. So like Rachel said, the data is absolutely incomplete and missing. And what else? But all of the schools have sites somewhere. And in a presentation I did, I say, if they don't acknowledge a burial site, they have a furnace on site, and you hear a lot of survivors telling stories about bodies getting put into furnaces. So sometimes there is no body to be found. So the numbers for any of the schools in Canada and the US will never be complete.
Thank you.
I
For
also wanted to add that, excuse me, genocide has been happening since colonization. So when I talk about missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, it's been happening since colonization. Now, for the U.S., Secretary of the Interior Holland, she announced a federal Indian boarding school initiative. So it's a comprehensive review of the legacy of our federal boarding schools and the policies, and trying to, shed light on what happened there, but also engage our tribes in that consultation, so that, there's so many things that are interconnected with that, protecting the burial sites. First, we have to identify them. We don't even know. So, with those, we have to, there has to be a report prepared of the historical records. We have to start counting also, and we have to look at the potential burial sites, and look at the bigger picture with that, because we don't have that data.
Thank you so much. I think a couple of the questions kind of touch on what you were just discussing regarding the U.S. connection, whether it be the statistics that Kayla showed, how similar are those statistics in the United States, and also, the similarities to the boarding and residential schools in the United States. What kind of knowledge can you, share with us on that?
Is that for me or Kayla? Or,
Whoever would like to.
okay.
You did, I know, Rachel, you just touched upon what has been just done in the last few years with our Secretary of Interior, the first Native American to ever occupy that position, very historic, of course, and what she is initiating. Is there anything else we know about what's happening on this side of the border that might be similar to what Kayla outlined is happening in Canada on a national level or even on a local level to help address the tragedy and the atrocities?
Well, for us in our community, we were just contacted by Bishop Ricken, and he reached out to our tribe to see what he can do in regards to burial sites and records. And so that is in the works for our community here, because we had St. Anthony's in Neopit on our reservation, and we had St. Joseph's, right, Miss Nell? Yeah, in Kashina. So there were 2 schools, and we still have yet to find out the truth behind everything and what happened to our children that went there. I've heard stories, but some of the people that were witness are gone. So we need those knowledge holders, those truth tellers.
My mom says there's St. Anthony's and St. Michael's on the reservation, and then there was Bethany Mission in Wittenberg. All of those are is it 30-60 mile radius, and then there was a day school on the Oneida reservation. All those are very close together, and students were shuttled between the schools. So again, records and stories, histories, not well kept,
Or kept at
or
all.
kept at all. Children were easily lost. So finding where they were, where they are. Yeah, everybody wants numbers. Everybody wants data, statistics, and hard lines, but they're not going to get those. We can't give them to you because we don't have them, and we'll never have them.
Yeah, we would like to have them too, but
There was another question that I know Kayla was answering some of the questions because we have so many, but I'll just raise it to the whole group because this is applicable to everybody. And it was just the very basic but important, vital question of how can this individual, I believe, said she was a teacher. So how can I as a teacher, or maybe I can broaden that and say, how can just I as an ally best support Native Americans who are victims or related to victims, or just have any experience with what you have discussed today? How could we best help and serve?
I would say the very best way is to listen to your students. It's kind of and across the board, no matter what nation your student comes from, meet them where they're at. Each student, it's not a cookie cutter story. Each individual experience, like I'm 2 generations out from the schools. I grew up with a mother who was angry and afraid to send me to school of what would happen to me at the school. knowing your students where they're at and not judging them, just providing a safe space for them, give them your ear, listen to them. Don't speak for them. Let their words be their story. What would you say, Mom?
I would say that the culture today and how many students have so many rights that it's hard for, like example, the elementary schools in some of the cities do not want teachers talking about LGB information. They don't want it in the schools. Now, it's the same way with some schools. They don't want to hear about Indians. They don't want to hear, oh God, now what? Now what do you want? Now how much money you going to take? Now how much money are we going to give you to just, satisfy what they don't want to hear? It's a money factor now. It's a shame that they don't, like Joy said, listen. They don't listen anymore. There's too many choices that a student can make. You as a teacher can be the most dedicated teacher in the world on two legs, but your compassion and stuff, if you have gotten through to one student, bless you. Thank you. If you've helped one student, what an honor. That one student could go on and help many others, or that one student could build on their own character and become something that they want, not necessarily what's handed to them. There.
A good friend of mine who may be listening today, who is a Potawatomi native, once said, please stand with us, not in front of us. And that's something I've taken to heart as an ally. And the idea of trying to support people that are native, that have their stories to tell and their truths to share, and not try to speak for them, I think is a key. At least that's a lesson that I've learned, and maybe I thought that would help just for me to share that as well. There are a couple of other questions here. I know that some of the questions have been answered by Kayla and others. I know some of the questions refer to resources where you could learn more, and you see in front of you the screen has a lot of the resources that could be helpful to anybody that is here tonight that would like to learn more or might even have similar experiences. I saw earlier there was a woman who shared that her grandparents had a very similar experience in Canada as Nell Lee. And so these are some resources that our guests have provided that you might want to look at. We see, let's see, can you speak about the schools that are still open in the US per the map you showed? That's a good question too. Do we know how many, if any, schools, you mentioned, Kayla, that the last residential school that's official closed in 1998 in Canada. Do we have any information about any of those schools still open in the United States, or are they all closed here in the US too?
I believe there are 15 schools still boarding in the United States, and I want to say it's 49 still in operation. Many of the schools in the 1950s converted from boarding schools to day schools, and then those schools then became the tribal schools on the reservation. So they have continuously operated under the oversight of the federal government. So there are still those schools, but they've just switched names and some oversight. But yeah, most of them gone from boarding schools to the tribal schools on the reservations. There are some that are operating as colleges. I know there's Haskell, Flandreau, and Sherman in the United States. There are 3 that come names that come to mind right now. But that's something that I'm still looking into as part of my own personal research.
And one of our schools, St. Anthony's schools in Neopet, was converted to our Menominee Tribal School.
Just to add thing about Joy, when she was a senior in high school in Shawano High School in Shawano, Wisconsin, she was given the opportunity to go to Europe. And when a parent would have a meeting of what would go on and everything, the teachers would get up and say, we have an opportunity to go to a place where they speak their language. And I said, they do that on a Menominee reservation. We'll be able to go to a place where we can see their culture. We have it on a Menominee reservation. The regalia, that the wooden shoes, all of this, you know, the art they create, we have that on a reservation. Then I thought, why should I pay X amount of dollars to send my school across the waters? And then I thought, why not? Why not? When she left, she was given tobacco to put down at certain spots where a Native American probably would never set their feet on. And she did this. So this carrying on traditional things go far more than what we're talking about tonight. And Joy experienced that when she was a senior in high school. And we earned, we borrowed, we begged, and everything for the money that we had to raise for her to go to Europe, across the big water, how we would say. And somebody else would say, oh, she took a plane to Europe. No, this is a tremendous event. A small town girl from a small town reservation and great big United States goes across the big waters. It's just more than what we're talking about tonight. That's it.
Go ahead. I was going to say thank you. Go ahead, Kayla.
As always, jumping the gun, I unmute, but I don't want to jump too fast. So the last thing I wanted to share first is I put in a link into the chat. This should also be made available. I had so many suggested resources that it was too much. So what you're getting is a full PowerPoint with notes that have reading suggestions from kids up to adults. It has a number of great websites. But the question that came in was, you know, what can I do to help my students? Well, I list 4 resources on allyship that were included in the National Inquiry's Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls in Two-Spirit work in 2019 that I think you may find very useful. But I also have some other really great content in there. And when it comes to schools today that are still open, we still have boarding type schools here in Canada for Indigenous students. A lot of these remote flying communities don't have that capacity to have a full high school. So what we often see is if students want to get that high school education, they are forced to leave community to attend one of these public schools or boarding schools. And in fact, one of the resources I touch upon or I highlight is things you can do is reach out to MPs, let them know why Indigenous rights is so important. And it talks about a really great hero here in Canada. Her name was Shannon Coustache. She had the greatest student-led letter writing campaign in Canadian history to get a new school built in community. And in fact, they did succeed. But it's something that campaign is still fighting for, safe and comfy schools for all communities, all First Nation on reserve communities across Canada, because we're still having to send children away from home.
Thank you all so much. I believe our time is over. We've gone a few minutes over, so I appreciate you staying a few minutes beyond our allotted time. If we could just end with, if anybody would like to make one final sort of statement about allyship or just, a word of just what you would like the attendees to come away with, and maybe ways that the broader community, the world community, could help in the future.
And I guess the words that come to mind are make the space and yield the floor.
Beautifully stated. So again, on behalf of all of us that were involved in this effort tonight, I'd like to say thank you to everybody that for sharing your time, your emotional energies, your spirits, your truths with everybody tonight. And I would also like to take this opportunity to remind everybody that this is just the first of a 3-part series, the second of which will focus primarily on Native and Indigenous women on or around May 5th, focusing on the MMIWG2S movement. And then in September 30th to be exact, which is the Canadian National Day of Reconciliation, Truth and Reconciliation, we will have our third and final presentation of this 3. So thank you all so much for attending. Thank you all so much for presenting, and take care of yourselves. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Night.
Thanks. Good night.